Doris Day was one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood history. Then her husband died, and she found out the money was gone. On April 20th, 1968, Martin Melcher, her husband of 17 years, her manager, her agent, and the one person holding legal power of attorney over nearly every contract she signed, died of heart disease in Beverly Hills. He was 51. In the weeks that followed, Doris Day learned 3 things, one after another, with no one left alive to explain any of them. She was close to $500,000 in debt, almost $20 million of her own earnings. Money from 2 decades of films and records had disappeared, and 5 months before his death, her husband had signed her, without telling her, to star in a CBS television series she didn't know existed until after he was no longer there to answer for it. "I was delivered to CBS," she said later. She had never wanted to do television. What happened to that $20 million took an 18-year professional relationship, a 99-day trial, and nearly 2 decades of appeals to even partially untangle. Some of it the courts could prove beyond doubt. Some of it no one. Not the judge who heard every page of testimony, not the family that spent 20 years chasing the answer, has ever been able to fully account for. The man at the center of it wasn't Martin Melcher. It was the lawyer Melcher trusted completely, a man who controlled the Melcher's money for 18 years before anyone outside his own office had the access to check his work. This is the documented story of how Doris Day lost a fortune to the man she loved, and how long the truth took to surface once he was no longer there to control it. If you're new here, this is Old Money Wives, where we go through the financial and legal record behind the women history mostly remembers for their image, not their bank statements. Subscribe if you want more stories built from court documents instead of rumor. Now back to where this one started. See. In Cincinnati, 1939, more than a decade before any of it. She was born Doris Mary and von Kappelhoff in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1922, to first-generation German-American parents. As a child, she trained as a dancer. A car struck the vehicle she was riding in during her early teens, badly breaking her leg, and the dancing ambition ended with it. During the long recovery, she started taking singing lessons instead, almost as a way to fill the time. It became the thing that mattered. By 17, she was performing with bandleader Barney Rapp at a club called the Sign of the Drum. Rapp thought Kappelhoff was too long and too German-sounding for a marquee, and renamed her after a song in her set, Day After Day. She kept the name the rest of her life, though she told her biographer she never much liked it. Said more than once that it sounded, to her, like something invented rather than earned. It was in Rapp's band that she met Al Jordan, the band's trombonist, 8 years older than her. She wasn't interested in him at first. By her own account, she told her mother he was a creep, and turned down his first invitations outright. He kept asking. Her mother, Alma, disapproved of the relationship from early on and said so plainly, but the objection didn't hold. Eventually, somewhere between his persistence and her stated wish, repeated in interviews throughout her life, to settle into an ordinary married home rather than a touring career, she gave in. They married in 1941. She was 19. What followed, by the account she gave in her 1975 autobiography Doris Day. Her own story, written with A. E. Hotchner, was not the domestic stability she'd hoped for. She described Jordan striking her for the first time within the first 2 days of the marriage, after he saw another musician hand her a wedding gift. The violence did not let up after that. She became pregnant. She has said Jordan tried repeatedly to pressure her into ending the pregnancy, and that the conflict over it turned dangerous enough that she began making quiet plans to leave him before their son was even born. Their son, Terry, arrived in 1942. Not long afterward, she left for good, taking the baby back to her mother's house in Cincinnati. She never saw Jordan again. He was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, and in 1967, the year before Melcher's death, he died by suicide. She was 20 years old, divorced, a single mother, and already, in a pattern that would repeat itself, someone who had escaped a man's control over her by simply walking away from it rather than confronting it head-on. With a child to support, she went back to the only trade she knew. She rejoined Les Brown's band as a touring vocalist, and in 1944 recorded Sentimental Journey with the Brown Orchestra. a record that reached #1 the following year and turned her, while she was still in her early 20s and raising her son largely on the road, into a name radio audiences knew before a single studio had put her in front of a camera. A second marriage, to saxophonist George Weidler, followed in 1946 and lasted under a year. It was, in an odd footnote to the larger story, Weidler who encouraged her to take a screen test at Warner Brothers while their own marriage was already coming apart. He believed she had a future in pictures that she herself wasn't actively pursuing. He turned out to be right. By the time the marriage ended, the studio had signed her. Her first starring role came in Romance on the High Seas in 1948. It was a hit. Within 3 years she was making 3 and 4 films annually, building a recording career in parallel. Her voice was already familiar to radio audiences before most of them ever saw her face on a screen. By the early 1950s, the Quigley poll of exhibitors, the industry's standard measure of box office drawing power, already had her among the top stars in the country, a position she would hold, with some fluctuation, for most of the next 15 years. The films from this period built the version of Doris Day the public would remember longest. The title role in Calamity Jane in 1953, whose song Secret Love won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Love Me or Leave Me in 1955, a dramatic turn as singer Ruth Etting that many critics, and Day herself, considered her finest screen performance, though it brought her no Oscar nomination, and Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1956, in which her performance of K. Sarah won a second Best Original Song Oscar and became the closest thing she had to a signature recording. It was during this same period, while filming The Winning Team in 1952, that she had a brief, well-documented romance with her co-star and future President Ronald Reagan. She wrote about it candidly in her autobiography, describing him as a skilled dancer with what she called a naturally political personality, though the relationship ended without either of them attaching much weight to it afterward. By 1959, with Pillow Talk, she had her only Academy Award nomination, for Best Actress, and a new screen partnership with Rock Hudson that would define the next phase of her career. The Quigley poll put her at #1 in the country in 1960, and again every year from 1962 through 1964, a run matched by only a handful of performers in the history of the ranking, and by almost no other woman. Decades later, several entertainment industry rankings would still place her as the highest-grossing female box office star in American film history, once her movies' grosses were adjusted across the decades against everyone who came after her. She was, in other words, not simply a star of her moment. By the metric Hollywood itself used to measure stardom, she was arguably the most commercially successful actress to ever appear on an American screen. At the exact same time, her husband was quietly losing control of what that success was worth. Fan magazines of the period, Photoplay, Modern Screen, and others built on the same formula, ran a steady stream of profiles built around the same handful of approved details: her love of home cooking, her devotion to her son, her cheerful disposition on set. The machinery that produced those stories was not separate from the studio system that employed her. It was a coordinated part of it, built to keep anything complicated about a working actress's private life off the page entirely. None of this is in dispute. What deserves a closer look, because it sits underneath everything that follows, is how completely that public image, wholesome, sunny, the eternal girl next door, had calcified by this point into something audiences needed to be true. The comedian Oscar Levant's joke about having known her before she became a virgin became one of the most quoted lines about her precisely because it captured how thoroughly her on-screen persona had displaced any sense of her as a private person with a private history. That private history by 1959 already included one abusive marriage, one short and forgettable one, and a third, the one she was currently in, that was, in ways she did not yet have visibility into, already deciding the shape of the rest of her life. She married Martin Melcher in 1951. He had been her agent since 1949, and after the wedding his role expanded into something closer to chief executive of her professional life. Producer, manager, and, under a power of attorney she had granted him, the person legally authorized to sign contracts in her name without bringing them to her first. He adopted her son Terry, who took the Melcher name. On the surface, for years, the arrangement appeared to work. Melcher produced 18 of her films between 1956 and his death, and some of her most successful pictures, including Pillow Talk, were made under his management. He was not making these decisions alone. From 1956 onward, his closest advisor was a Beverly Hills attorney named Jerome B. Rosenthal, whose GUE The trial court would later find Melcher had come to depend on for virtually every financial decision he made. Rosenthal had represented the couple since 1952. By the mid-1950s, he occupied every financial role around them simultaneously. Their attorney, their accountant, their business manager, their investment advisor, and their record keeper. No outside party was checking his work because every function that might have done the checking ran through his own office. He represented not only Day and Melcher personally but several of the corporations built around her career: Arwen Productions, Daywin Music, Artists Music, Martin Melcher Productions, giving him visibility into and influence over essentially every channel through which her income passed. The civil court records compiled over the following decade describe a clear pattern. Rosenthal steered Melcher's money, and through Melcher, Day's earnings, into ventures in hotels and oil interests in which Rosenthal himself held an undisclosed financial stake, while simultaneously billing the Melchers legal fees for arranging the same deals. The mechanics were straightforward once a court finally laid them out. Rosenthal would identify an investment, route the Melchers' money into it, collect a fee from the Melchers for the legal work involved in setting it up, and collect a separate, undisclosed benefit from the deal itself, meaning he was paid by his clients to expose them to risk he personally profited from regardless of whether the investment ever paid off. The appellate court that reviewed the case afterward would later describe the business judgment behind some of these ventures as amateurish to the point of being almost comic, if the financial consequences for the people whose money was actually at risk hadn't been so severe. A state bar disciplinary panel, examining the same conduct years later under a different legal standard, would eventually find that Rosenthal had engaged in undisclosed conflicts of interest, overstated his expenses, double-billed for the same legal work, and refused for years to turn over client files and financial records that would have let the Melchers see, in real time, what was actually happening to their money. The same panel went further than the civil court ever needed to. It concluded Rosenthal had filed fraudulent claims, given false testimony under oath, and deliberately worked to harass his former clients and obstruct the very proceedings meant to hold him accountable. Decades later, an attorney who worked on the discipline case would still describe Rosenthal by a blunt nickname earned over those 2 decades of delay: the man who was too mean to die. It is also worth saying plainly that the arrangement Day was living under was not unusual for a woman of her generation in the entertainment industry. Studio-era actresses routinely signed broad powers of attorney over to husbands or managers, on the assumption, rarely questioned at the time by the press or by the women themselves, that the business of money was a husband's domain and the business of performing was the wife's. Other prominent actresses of the same studio era have, in their own memoirs and interviews over the decades, described comparable arrangements with husbands or managers, with outcomes ranging from uneventful to ruinous depending almost entirely on the integrity of the one man holding the pen. The structure that failed Doris Day was not an aberration invented for her specifically. It was the ordinary structure of the industry she worked in, operating exactly as designed, with no built-in mechanism to catch the one man inside it who chose to abuse it. Day, by her own account, was largely kept outside this process, and increasingly outside her own career decisions as well. The years in which Rosenthal's control over the Melchers' finances was at its most extensive, roughly 1959 through the mid-1960s, were the same years in which Day was topping the queue. Hughley Pole and starring in some of the brightest, lightest comedies of her career. That Touch of Mink, Move Over, Darling, Send Me No Flowers. Audiences watching her trade quips with Cary Grant or Rock Hudson on screen had no reason to suspect that the woman they were watching had, by that point, almost no independent visibility into her own bank accounts. The persona and the circumstances behind it were never meant to occupy the same frame. She wrote that by the mid-1960s, Melcher was committing her to film projects without asking whether she wanted to make them at all, naming specifically Do Not Disturb, The Ballad of Josie, Caprice, and Where Were You When the Lights Went Out, as pictures she didn't want to do and made anyway, because the decision was no longer hers to make. There is a frequently repeated story, told in most retrospectives of her career, that Melcher was offended by the source novel for The Graduate and never even showed her the script. A decision that, if accurate, cost her a role that went instead to in Bancroft and might have reshaped the back half of her career. The story rests on second-hand accounts rather than a document in Day's own hand, and deserves to be read with that qualification attached. What is not in dispute is the broader fact it illustrates. By the late 1960s, her husband was making decisions about her career and her money with minimal input from her, and almost no outside oversight at all. By the time anyone outside that arrangement had a clear view into it, Martin Melcher was already gone. His health had reportedly been declining for some time before April 1968. His death, when it came, was sudden enough that those around Day, by multiple later accounts, described her as unprepared, not simply for the grief, but for what the grief uncovered underneath it. There was no single afternoon when someone sat her down and explained everything. There was an accountant's report here, a creditor's letter there, a call from a N.E. Twerk executive assuming she already knew about an agreement she had never seen. The television contract surfaced first. Melcher had negotiated a deal with CBS that would bring his production company several $1 million up front for a weekly series starring his wife. A deal industry trade press at the time reportedly called a Fort Knox hand, and a deal he had never discussed with her, because, by her account, he knew she did not want to do television. He died 5 months before the show was due to premiere. She has said she learned of her own contractual obligation to CBS only afterward, effectively from the network itself, rather than from her husband while he was alive to explain it. The money came next. Whatever she had earned across 2 decades, tens of millions of dollars by most contemporary estimates, between her film salaries and her recording royalties, had been largely spent, mismanaged, or lost. Properties had been mortgaged. Investments Rosenthal had steered Melcher toward had failed. She has said she was left close to $500,000 in debt. There was no large reserve sitting untouched behind the image of America's sweetheart. There was a stack of obligations and a CBS contract she had never agreed to in the first place. She did not speak about any of this publicly for years. In 1975, the same year the trial court's judgment in her favor was entered, she published Doris Day, her own story, written with journalist A.E. Hotchner, who built the book as an oral history drawn from her own recollections, interwoven with comments from friends, co-stars, and colleagues. For a star whose career had been built almost entirely on a carefully maintained image of cheerful ease, the book was unusually direct. It was where she first spoke publicly about Jordan's violence, about Melcher signing contracts behind her back, and about discovering the scale of the debt only after his death. It became, in effect, the primary public account against Wick. Every later retelling of her life would be measured, including the testimony and findings already sitting, by then, in the California court record. She did not walk away from the CBS contract either. By her son Terry's later account, it was Terry, 26 at the time, and already building his own career as a record producer, having worked with acts including the Byrds in the years just before his stepfather's death and going on to work with other major recording artists over the following decade, who pushed her toward honoring the deal rather than fighting it, on the reasoning that the upfront money and the weekly salary were the fastest practical route out of the debt Melcher and Rosenthal had left behind. It put Terry, abruptly and without much preparation, into something close to the role his stepfather had occupied, the family member standing between Doris Day and the business decisions affecting her name. He took an executive producer credit on the series during parts of its run, and remained involved in his mother's affairs in one capacity or another for the rest of her life. The Doris Day Show premiered on CBS that September. It ran for 5 seasons and 128 episodes, through 1973, remembered today partly for how often its premise and supporting cast changed from year to year, and partly, inseparably, for the circumstances under which its star came to make it at all. A show she didn't choose, fulfilled out of necessity, that nonetheless became, by the ratings, one of the steadier hits on the network for most of its run. She also did something else in the months after the funeral. In December 1968, 8 months after Melcher's death, she and Terry filed a formal complaint against Jerome Rosenthal with the California State Bar. It would take nearly 20 years to reach a final answer. The disciplinary process moved at a pace almost impossible to summarize without listing it out. At Day's own request, the State Bar deferred its investigation until September 1971 so the family could concentrate on the civil case first. Rosenthal was not formally notified of the substance of the complaint against him until February 1972. He answered 2 months later. A notice to show cause wasn't served on him until January 1973. Hearings before the disciplinary panel did not begin until November 1974, 6 years after the complaint was filed, and only after the civil trial had already produced its own verdict. That civil trial had begun its own separate countdown the moment the Melchers cut Rosenthal out of their affairs. He did not wait to be sued. He filed first, claiming an oral agreement with Martin Melcher had entitled him to 50% ownership of the combined Day Melcher business interests, a claim the trial judge would later find had no documentary support behind it at all. Day and the Melcher family corporations answered with cross-complaints of their own, alleging legal malpractice, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and abuse of process. 13 related lawsuits were eventually folded into one case, Day versus Rosenthal. The trial ran 99 days, heard without a jury by Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Lester E. Olson. 67 witnesses testified, among them accountants, business associates, and former employees of Rosenthal's own office, called to reconstruct, transaction by transaction, where the money had actually gone over 18 years. The transcript ran past 14,000 pages. Contemporary reporting put the cost to California taxpayers at roughly $250,000. Not counting the more than $62,000 in transcript costs the parties themselves had to absorb. Legal commentary written decades later still singled the case out as an unusually drawn-out piece of California civil litigation, measured against everything else that has ever passed through the state's courts. In September 1974, Olson delivered his decision aloud, in an oral ruling that took an hour to read. He described an 18-year professional relationship that had curdled, by his account, almost from the start. An attorney who, in Olson's characterization, had become so intent on doing business with his clients, with their money, that he had lost sight of the ethical boundaries his profession required of him. His findings described kickbacks, the favoring of some clients over others depending on what served Rosenthal's own interests, and, repeatedly, the extraction of legal fees from the Melchers for work that, in substance, served Rosenthal's personal investments rather than his clients. The judge found Rosenthal had also used side agreements and layered business structures to try to lock in his own position for years beyond what any ordinary attorney-client relationship would justify. Critically, Olson found that Rosenthal had never adequately explained to the Melchers the terms, the risks, or the basic implications of the 1956 retainer agreements that had handed him such sweeping control over their finances to begin with. They had signed, the court found, without understanding what they were signing. Judgment was entered on March 31, 1975, $22,835,646 in favor of Doris Day, the estate of Martin Melcher, Terry Melcher, and their family corporations. By the time interest and $1 million in punitive damages were added, the total reached $26,396,511, among the largest legal malpractice judgments in California history at the time. A number that size suggests an ending. It wasn't one. This is the point in the record where the story resists a clean summary. The trial established, with extensive documentary support upheld at every level of subsequent review, that Rosenthal had breached his duties and profited at his client's direct expense. That finding never seriously wavered through a decade of appeals. But how much of Day's original fortune was lost specifically to Rosenthal's fraud, as opposed to the ordinary risks of business decisions Melcher made on his own, or simply to the routine? Overspending of a two-income Hollywood household running multiple production companies for nearly 2 decades is not a question the surviving record answers with full precision. 99 days of testimony produced a verdict. They did not produce an accounting precise enough to satisfy every later inquiry into exactly where every dollar went. Rosenthal appealed, and it took 10 years. By this stage, he wasn't seriously disputing the underlying facts so much as exhausting nearly every procedural avenue available to delay the judgment from ever being enforced. At one point, even filing a separate, unsuccessful lawsuit against the state bar employees who were simultaneously prosecuting the ethics case against him. The Court of Appeal finally affirmed the trial court's judgment in August 1985, preserving Judge Olson's findings almost entirely intact. 2 years after that, in 1987, the California Supreme Court disbarred Rosenthal outright, the conclusion of a state bar disciplinary proceeding that had itself dragged on for nearly 2 decades. A delay later attorneys reviewing the case attributed in large part to Rosenthal's own tactics. The length of that disciplinary fight became, separate from Day's own financial recovery, part of the case's lasting legacy. Legal commentary on the matter afterward pointed to it as a clear example of how poorly California's volunteer-based attorney discipline system handled a determined, well-resourced respondent who simply refused to stop delaying. The case is cited, alongside other reform arguments from the same period, as part of what pushed the state toward replacing that volunteer system with a full-time professional state bar court, ultimately implemented in 1989, more than 2 decades after Day first filed her complaint, and roughly 2 years after Rosenthal himself was finally struck from the rolls. But here is the part the headline number never captured. By the time enforcement became practically possible, Rosenthal had declared bankruptcy. A $26 million judgment against a man who has filed for bankruptcy is, in practice, mostly a number on paper. What Day actually recovered came not from Rosenthal himself but from his malpractice insurance carriers, who settled with her in August 1977, 8 years before the appeal was even resolved, for $6 million, paid out across 23 annual installments rather than as a lump sum. That structure meant the settlement functioned less like a windfall and more like a long, slow annuity arriving in yearly increments stretched across more than 2 decades. Money that, by the time later installments arrived, was reaching a woman well into her 60s and 70s, long after the television series originally meant to recover the lost fortune had already gone off the air. Terry Melcher said in a 1986 interview that the family ultimately received nothing close to the figure that had made headlines in 1974. The number the courts announced and the money that actually arrived, in pieces over more than 2 decades, were never the same thing. She had, by any fair reading of this record, won the lawsuit decisively and still lost most of the underlying money permanently, not because Rosenthal kept it for himself, but because it had largely ceased to exist in recoverable form by the time the legal system finished the long work of saying so. In 1976, she married a 4th time, to restaurant maitre d' Barry Comden. They divorced in 1980. By accounts from people close to the marriage, the split was connected at least in part to Comden's frustration with how much of her time, attention, and money went toward stray and abandoned animals. That was not, by this point in her life, a passing interest. Over the following decades it became close to the organizing purpose of everything she did publicly. She had founded the Doris Day Pet Foundation in 1978, later renamed the Doris Day Animal Foundation, and in 1987 established the Doris Day Animal League, a Washington-based lobbying organization that pushed for animal welfare legislation for years afterward. In 1985 she bought the Cypress Inn, a hotel in Carmel, California, and ran it as a pet-friendly property, living nearby in Carmel Valley for the rest of her life. By most accounts from people who knew her there, the work suited her in a way Hollywood never fully had. It gave her a cause she had chosen herself, run on her own terms, answerable to no studio, no husband, and no attorney holding power of attorney over the decisions. Guests at the inn over the following decades described an owner who was visible but unannounced, present in the lobby or the garden, rarely introduced as the famous Doris Day unless someone happened to recognize her first. She gave very few interviews after this point. She made no films after Melcher's death in 1968, and stepped back from regular television work once her series ended in 1973, beyond the occasional special appearance. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences reportedly offered her an honorary Oscar more than once in later years, to recognize her standing as one of the highest-grossing female stars in box office history. By most reporting on the matter, she declined each time, having come to regard the film industry as a closed chapter of her life rather than something worth revisiting, even ceremonially. There is one further thread worth recording, documented mainly through public statements made by her grandson, Ryan Melcher, after her death. He has said that in her final years, access to her was controlled by a longtime manager, and that he was kept from seeing his own grandmother for an extended period following his father Terry's death from cancer in 2004. These are claims made publicly, not findings established in any court, and they should be read with that distinction held clearly in mind. But they sit, uncomfortably, beside a documented history, established this time in a courtroom, decades earlier, of people close to Doris Day controlling her access to her own decisions, her own contracts, and her own money, often without her full knowledge until well after the fact. She died on May 13, 2019, at her home in Carmel Valley, of complications from pneumonia, at the age of 97. She had outlived Martin Melcher by 51 years, nearly as long as he had been alive at all. In the years since, Day versus Rosenthal has continued to surface in discussions of celebrity financial exploitation, usually as the first-named example legal writers reach for. Not because the dollar figures were the largest ever recorded, but because the documentation was so complete, and because the central fact at its core has recurred, in different forms, across enough other careers to look less like a single woman's misfortune and more like a pattern. A star earning the money, a trusted man controlling it, and a gap of years before anyone outside that arrangement was positioned to ask basic questions about where it had gone. What the record supports is this: a woman who earned, across 2 decades of prolific and disciplined work, what was by any measure an enormous fortune, and who handed control of that fortune to her husband under an arrangement common to women of her generation in Hollywood. One in which a wife's earnings were managed by her husband as an ordinary matter of course, not as a special act of trust or suspicion. What undid her was not a single decision but a structure built on top of that arrangement. A husband who delegated his own financial judgment almost entirely to a single attorney with no outside party checking his conduct, for the better part of 2 decades, while that attorney profited personally from arrangements a court would later find fraudulent in detail. There is no evidence in the record that Martin Melcher set out to destroy his wife's finances, and the courts that examined the case in full did not treat him as its central figure. Rosenthal was. But Melcher's signature is the one on the contracts she never saw. His decisions, made without consulting her, are what placed her in front of CBS cameras against her stated wishes and left her exposed the moment the money underneath her stopped being there. Judge Olson's own ruling described Melcher as having remained, for nearly the entire relationship, in something close to deference toward Rosenthal's judgment. Not malice in the court's own framing of it, so much as an abdication of attention that produced, for the person depending on him, much the same result malice would have. It's worth sitting with that distinction for a moment, because it's the part of this story easiest to flatten into something simpler than it was. Rosenthal was found, by a court that heard 99 days of evidence and by a state bar panel that spent nearly 20 years on the question, to have acted with deliberate, self-interested dishonesty. Melcher was found, by the same record, to have failed his wife through inattention and misplaced trust rather than through any comparable intent to harm her. Both men left her in the same position. The law, when it finally rendered judgment, did not treat their conduct as equivalent, and the available record gives no reason to think it should have. But for a woman discovering, weeks after a funeral, that she was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and contractually bound to a television show she never agreed to make, the difference between a husband's negligence and a lawyer's fraud was not, in that moment, the thing that mattered most. For the better part of 50 years after Melcher's death, Doris Day was asked, gently and sometimes not so gently, to confirm or deny the version of her that Hollywood had settled on back in 1948, bright, wholesome, endlessly cheerful, untouched by anything difficult enough to leave a mark. She rarely obliged the question directly. She talked about her dogs instead, and about the hotel, and about almost nothing fr. The years in between. What she did do once, in 1975, was put her own account on the record in her own words, in a book she chose to write rather than a courtroom she was forced into. Between that book and the California court archives, the fuller picture of what happened to her money, and to her, has always been available to anyone willing to read past the version on the movie posters. Most people, for most of the last 50 years, simply hadn't.